Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I'm preparing to check in on one of my worm bins, the red wiggler bin that's the oldest at this point. It's 151 days old and it's been a week now since I tried to initiate the migration of the worms out of the finished compost because I've got some stats over here pertaining to its age and other information about it. Um, so now out of the 141 days, it was during the original first 96 days that I just kept feeding it. I had built the bin with some food, which was its initial feeding, and then following that there came 13 feedings of that bin. And then after those first 96 days, I started to think that, hey, I'm starting to end up with a pretty nice batch of material here. Maybe I'll try to drive it towards completion. So I suspended feedings and withheld feedings for a while, giving the worms a chance to forage through the material, break down all the stuff to the best of their ability. I even went so far as to pull some stuff out of there to try to help encourage that process get to the point where I could really feel like the majority of the stuff is mainly castings only. And, I waited a while. I waited 38 days. It's about 5.5 weeks. And, I probably could have gone a little bit longer because there's still little chunks of leaves and bedding and other things in there. But I figured, you know what? Why don't I start the initiation of the migration of the worms out of that stuff and consider that as finished compost. So it was 1 week ago today that they received another feeding, but that feeding was positioned on the very edge of the bin, all the way on the far edge of the bin, in the hopes that the worms are going to move out of the material over into that fresh feeding area. And at some point we'll be able to hopefully just scoop them right out of there, and they will have abandoned the finished compost by that time, making it really easy to just harvest the material by simply scooping it out or pouring it out. So I'm going to get this bin up on the bench here. I've got some stuff with which I was going to try to reinforce the feeding zone, the horizontal migration feeding zone. It's just some scraps of carrots, some white carrots, some other various odds and ends in here, as well as a little bit of used coffee. So why don't we grab that bin? It's the one that's right here behind me. Get it up on the bench and get to work. So now out here on the top surface of the container, you can see that only one side of it has plastic coverings, and it's over here where I've been trying to encourage the recirculation of whatever moisture is under there, which is the fresh food, fresh bedding, and everything like that. Over here where it's simply paper, the idea here has been to just allow the bin a little bit more access to the opportunity to evaporate and dry off a little bit. And it's clearly visible that the material is starting to dry a little on the surface. So in most cases like this, what I've typically done in the past was give the worms about a week to work down, to first locate the feeding area, which I assume is probably pretty quick to occur, because with no feedings happening in this bin for 38 days, I'm sure that this, the introduction of a fresh load of food on one side of the bin makes for a serious motivator. But at this point, after only a week's time, I typically won't initiate the extraction of worms quite yet. What I'll do is I'll just try to add a little bit more fresh food to the far, far outer edge of the bin. And that's what we're going to do today. But it's interesting, I am kind of noticing almost like if there's like a little bit of a pitch going down in the direction of the in the feeding area, almost as if the stuff over on this edge has been pretty much broken down, stuff over here not so much. But then again, what remained over here to be broken down was very limited. I guess another thing we could do here is collect up some of these uncomposted bits and pieces of dry junk on the surface. We could include that over in the feeding area too, which is pretty much the spot where we expect feedings to be continuing, maybe not so much out here anymore. I mean, I did kind of hope that they would continue breaking down materials out on this side, while at the same time also working their way over into the new feeding area. But as things continue to dry on this side, and with that recirculating moisture happening on this side over here, I would think that whether it's the fresh food or just the presence of continued moisture recirculating over here, there's multiple reasons why one might expect that they'd be piling into this side of the container at this point. I did want to lay down some of this paper, some of this bedding. I didn't expect to see a lot of the bedding that I used in here to be gone yet. Although I wouldn't be surprised if some of the food that we placed in here might have a pretty big dent in it by this time. So I thought that we could use some of this older bedding over here as the foundation for the fresh food. So I just took some of these paper scraps here, and we'll use those as the basis for adding the fresh food to the outer edge. But I'm curious to see how some of the things that we placed in here are coming along, because one thing I had done was I had taken a whole banana and I split it down the long way and opened it up into two large halves, kind of like two banana boats, like a banana split opening. And just curious to see how they're progressing with those two opened up bananas. So one of them is here, and it almost seems like they've emptied out a good portion of the sweet, you know, meaty portion of the banana. I don't know what this is, just a piece of paper or something like that, maybe with some coffee on it. So they've done a really good job. They've almost stripped it all out of here. But I'm surprised it's not mobbed with worms. It's interesting. Or is it possible that this stuff just sort of collapsed in on itself and this is still all the same original material? Just, I don't know, just collapsed down in a way? Let's see if we can find the other half banana in here to see how that one's coming along. It looks very much the same. Kind of weird, you know? It's almost as if they maybe stripped away as much of it as they could, and then they went looking for other things that were of more interest to them or something. I don't know why, I just sometimes feel like I want to understand the behaviors I'm observing in my bins. Because, you know, it's good to understand what they do and why, because then you could tailor your strategies for dealing with them based on that information that you've collected. Even if some of it is just a hypothesis, if you can't really, you know, back it up with solid facts. So this looks pretty good here. Good number of worms have collected in this feeding area, that's for sure. I'm almost wondering if a good thing to place right in here is a lot of this sort of dry, uncomposted stuff that I scooped off the top surface, because they'll all have to make their way through that on their way towards the fresh food. So let's, and I guess when I was probing around, it felt to me like over on this side there might be even more worms down low. That does seem to be the case, because there are just tons and tons of worms all the way down here, and so many little baby worms too. Look at all those little tiny baby worms. It's pretty cool to see too. I don't want to go too crazy disrupting things, but I guess it's too late for that. I didn't really intend to stir things up quite this much, but I just somehow couldn't resist. My my curiosity got the best of me. But as you can see, this feeding area is mobbed with worms at this point. They've certainly come over as if on cue to come grab all the food that we laid out for them. So that's pretty cool. So like I said, I'm not going to be extracting worms today, even though it does seem like I could have very well done so if I had wanted to. We could have taken a whole bunch of worms out of here, and I wonder if that might have actually benefited us a little bit. It doesn't matter. I'm going to stick to the game plan here. I'm just going to take a lot of this stuff that we scooped off the top before and use that as the basis for the new addition of feeding materials that we're going to place in here. And I always like to put it on the far edge, because all the partially broken down stuff over here will continue to sustain them quite nicely And then as the stuff on the far edge out here starts to break down, it too will spur on their movement. So I think we'll toss this coffee on the very top after we place in all of these carrots and soup greens and sort of different types of materials. It's all resting on top of a piece of paper, so let's see if I can pull it out of here in one felt swoop. The piece of paper can also serve as a nice little boost to the bedding over there. This stuff's all frozen, mostly carrot peelings, and as it thaws out, it too is going to emit a little bit of moisture. Carrots I don't think have a huge amount of moisture in them, but I believe that most things that get frozen and are left to thaw afterwards do probably emit a little bit more moisture than if they had not been frozen. Let's also get these bananas back out onto the far edge, because I think they're probably a key contributor to the worms making their way all the way out to the far edge too, because of this really tasty item that they really like. I want that to be on the very, very far edge of the bin, if possible. Alright, so we're going to level things off here a little bit. But it's a good thing that the coffee's right here on top, so I don't forget it. Forgetting the coffee is one of my trademark goof ups. Okay, things look pretty good here. Let's introduce this coffee. I like the coffee also because it seems like it's going to help mask the odor of some of these things that might have the potential to attract flying insects and pests and whatever. So it almost seems like covering up the banana is a good idea, and doing so with coffee is, I think, a pretty effective way to do it. So I guess we'll just tear up this paper into little strips and try to cover up the feeding area. This will also serve as additional bedding type material for this feeding area. Okay. And then back goes the plastic to keep all the moisture that's in this area recirculating, kind of captured into a little bit of a terrarium to not allow it to evaporate. Unlike what we've seen over here where the evaporation is left to happen, for the most part, yeah, we got a piece of newspaper on top, but I don't think that does a lot. I think the evaporation on this side probably works pretty nicely, even with that covering on it. But before we cover things up, I want to see how this finished casting material is coming along. I mean, yeah, we're probably going to expect to find little pieces of leaf scraps and other bedding bits in here. But on many occasions, we've gone through this material trying to extract any such stuff to limit the amount of food-like materials in this casting batch, so that they don't end up kind of just, you know, hanging out to eat this, but rather go looking throughout the bin for a better place to find food. So there are still a good number of worms hanging out in here. I gotta remember not to displace too many of the worms I find right here on the edge, because the fact that they've come this far and they're so close to where I want them to be is great. I don't want to set them back and move them back into the dry stuff. The fact that they're already right here on the perimeter of where I want them to be is great. So I want to keep them there. So this material definitely has a good number of worms in it still, as we can see. Let's just take some of these larger scraps and move them over. I have to resist the urge to do that, I think, because if I did that, we can be here all day picking out little food scraps and move them over into the feeding area. So let me just try to make a concerted effort not to take up time doing that. I really just wanted to poke around in here a little bit, check out how the material's coming along. But I also believe that by sort of digging it up a little bit, it helps it air out and continue to dry off, making it less and less of a place where the worms would want to remain. the worms all having moved through this over to here, eating along the way, I think contributes to the material sort of collapsing in on itself a little bit and becoming a little bit more dense and less likely to shed its moisture. So I think by tilling it up a little bit this way and aerating it a little, it'll also contribute to the ability of the moisture to dry off even better. So there again, I don't want to go too crazy doing that, but I do want to make sure that I've given all the material that I possibly can a good stir. Sort of dislodge it from itself, unclump it a little, aerate it, and help it get a little bit more dry as it continues to just sit out here under the newspaper. All right, yeah, still a good number of worms remaining in this material, but the migration is definitely doing its job. As you can see, there's tons and tons of worms hanging out there, taking advantage of the fresh food supply, as well as the recirculating moisture. And at some point, I think not extracting worms could also be a detriment to this process, because at some point it does seem like things might just get too crowded over there. So I believe that the next time I check in here, which might be just another week or so from now, I will plan to do an extraction and relocation of worms into a different bin, and then a complete reset of the feeding area. Probably salvaging as much of this bedding material that's already in the works and partially broken down, and not moving that with the worms, and just trying to move the worms only, and then recycling as much of this uneaten food and bedding with which to rebuild the feeding zone to make it all the more a tempting place for the worms to want to move over to. But yeah, this material is really nice and still kind of damp, so I think stirring it up like this also helped a lot. Because whenever I start to sense that the material is sticking to my gloves quite a bit, that's when I sort of judge the material to be maybe a little bit more damp than it needs to be. Probably nice and cozy from the worm's point of view, but a little bit more damp than it needs to be, or than I want it to be. All right, very cool. I like the way this is progressing. We've now given this bin another feeding. I always do count these as additional feedings, even though they're not directly contributing to the material I'm ultimately harvesting. The feedings ultimately probably just end up going with the worms to their new home. But whatever, I'm sure there's a better and more accurate way to keep track of that information. Maybe someday I'll figure that out, but for now that's just the way I'm tracking it. All right, so I've got a little bit of cleaning up to do, but I'm not going to take your time up with that. This is the end of the video. But before I go really quick, I just want to say thank you. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Take care. Bye.